May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC Puba of Cuke Audio, coming to you from sleepy Sanur with Dogga, Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable, and free from economic hardship, and able to get out and do whatever it is you want within the confines of do as little harm as possible. Today I'm going to read another draft piece from a work in progress, Tassajara Stories, The Early Years with Shunryu Suzuki. So this one is called Darkly. I have not looked at it in months and months, so I'm just going to start reading it. And probably I can come back and fix any glitches in it or things I disagree with. So I will not subject you to those changes and decisions, but I'm sure I'll be making them. I put 3 X's down. X, X, X. All right. See, I'm going to copy that so I can just I can just paste it in where I want to go back and change something. All right, so we'll see how this one sounds. Actually, I'm just doing this on Tuesday. But when I do it, then I think I get a little excited. I think, oh boy. And that's why I decided to do this rather than read thank you and okay. It's because I need to get back into it and bring it to some sort of conclusion, which I've said a few times before. So we'll see. We'll see. I call it Darkly. And it will begin, oh yes, right after our pause to meditate. So when you hear the bell, if you wish, hit pause and meditate, if you wish, for as long as you wish. And when you're through, if you wish, hit unpause. And you will return to us and we'll hit the bell to end meditation. After a little more, give you a little more. And then we'll go right into Darkly. Right now, I don't remember why I called it that. So I'm looking forward to reading it. But anyway, here comes the bell. Shosan is a formal ceremony that we held at the end of the practice periods in which each student would ask the abbot a question. During one of the first Shosan ceremonies, a student walked up to the proper place before the seated Suzuki, dramatically bellowed the customary address of Docho Roshi, Docho is the abbot, in a voice reminiscent of a Kurosawa period piece. Heard Suzuki's affirmative height and asked, Are impulses okay? Suzuki said that yes, sometimes they are. The student then turned around without closing the exchange with the customary gassho and thank you very much, walked out of the zendo and came back to his spot eating a cookie, saying his garbled thanks with a mouthful. That student was Bob Halpern. It seems there were more extreme people at Tassajara in the old days. Students there seem so sedate and mature now. Many students were calm and mature back then as well, but Bob and I were not two of them. Bob came to Tassajara in the late spring of '67. I met him on the back porch by the old kitchen at the samovar, the coffee and tea area. He bore the countenance of a samurai, posturing dramatically while quoting the sixth patriarch, then started talking like a car salesman and getting buddy-buddy. He'd been sitting with Taizan Maizumi down in L.A. since 1965. Had a bookstore on the Sunset Strip called the Satori Shop, was one of the first people to sell those psychedelic concert posters that go for so much today. He'd read a lot about Eastern religion. We'd talk about all that stuff and Zazen and what teachers were most enlightened, who were the coolest spiritual heroes from the millennia gone by, tell our stories, and speculate on the future. We were fanatic about everything. When the bell rang or the han was struck, we'd go to the zendo and be fanatic about that. The schedule would exhaust a lot of people so that they'd nap when they could and get in their beds as soon as possible after evening zazen was over. Bob and I might sit with each other for another hour and then maybe go to the kitchen for a clandestine snack and then nod away sleep-deprived the next morning. Earlier that spring, I was sitting on a massive stone in the small creek below the bridge on a moonlit night after the fire watch had gone round hitting the clackers for all lights out. In time, I settled down and then felt as if floating. I started to see an Indian dancing on the stones in Tassajara Creek that flowed by not far in front. In a state unconnected to the world around me, suddenly there came a great intrusion, a painful attack that knocked me back. It was sound that penetrated and unsettled me so that I screamed out, "No, no, no!" I found myself lying sideways on the rock, looking up at Bob, who kneeled there with the bowl-shaped brass bell and striker from the zendo altar. He had snuck up behind me and struck the bell once hard, a few inches from my ear. Now women's heads were sticking out of dorm windows. I had recovered and was sitting up. Bob grimaced and shook his head with hands holding bell and striker up in the air, indicating he had no idea what the results of his actions would be. I made a mental note to try to cultivate meditation that did not render me so vulnerable to changes in the environment around me. I asked Bob please not to play Zen Master with me like that. Maybe Bob was influenced by a story about cutting firewood in the snow with his master, Soon, who pulled back the blade of a saw and snapped it on unsuspecting little Shunryu's frost-covered face in the bitter cold. That hurts to think about it. We'd read stories of masters doing extreme things to their disciples. A nose tweaked or a face slapped was common, But there's also a finger cut off, a leg broken, a cat cut in two. I didn't like these stories with serious injuries or mutilation, like Bodhidharma cutting off his eyelids so he wouldn't sleep in zazen, Huike offering his bloody severed arm stump to Bodhidharma to show his sincerity. They're mainly mythical, but I worry some young idiot will take them literally and do something harmful. Same with Kill the Buddha. There was a prominent Zen group out east where it got pretty violent. People were screaming and hitting, challenging each other in ceremonies with slaps on the face. One of their students took seriously the story of the monk who held a knife to his heart and vowed to kill himself if he didn't attain enlightenment that hour. The monk in the story got enlightened, but the one in real life shot himself in the head. A night in May, outside below the steps by the big old oak tree once called Gossip Oak. Our first week of guests. Dinner cleanup is over. A while before zazen. The night air fresh. People walking by, chatting on the road above the steps. The muffled sound of guests laughing and playing bocce ball from down in front of the pine rooms. The scene is illuminated by a few funky street lights powered by one of the generators with its clunky rumbling up in the shop. Moths gather round the light source. Outside of the main area, kerosene lanterns have been placed at intervals. Suddenly, that old Willie's Jeep engine was revving up higher. The lamps got rapidly brighter, and then with blinding light exploded like fireworks, one after another. In my daze in the dying light, I see Paul running up to the shop. The accelerating pitch of the whirring engine, which must be straining at the bolts, holding it tight to the floor until suddenly it stopped. Silence in the remaining dim light. Then voices from the left and right wondering what the heck had just happened. The fan belt had broken. I have only misty memories of that first 2 months we were open for guests and still using the old dining room, while what was to become the dining room was our temporary zendo. Peter Schneider, an earlier student of Suzuki's who'd returned at Baker's request to help out, had become the office manager and had an office in back. He'd be in there doing his office manager thing while the guests were being served. Other than that, what I conjure is a blur. The room seems dark. Reminds me of some readings I've gotten from the dearly departed through mediums. Looking back as in a dream darkly. I don't see as many guests there as later, or memorable encounters. Some parents, probably it was kept small on purpose. We were just feeling things out. So best to start small. My main memory of that time is that Bob Halpern was working with me in the dining room, and we were nuts. Putting Bob and me together in a work situation was asking for trouble. We could get like that generator without a fan belt. I see us now crouching behind the old bar, gobbling from the leftovers of the serving dishes, especially the baked chicken, downing the remains of the half and half, looking sideways to make sure Peter didn't walk out of his office and see us. The practice of any guest student who worked with us would be wounded with the worst examples of the whole place. Ed was under tremendous pressure in the kitchen, and we'd be running circles around that small room, confused about what to do next. Ed might get frustrated at the way a new student was cutting carrots. Not the straight slices, Chinese cut, diagonals. But nothing we did fazed him. And we didn't get in trouble because of our conduct, because there were no complaints. I guess we conducted ourselves with enough civility while interacting with guests and probably gave them a sense of relief not to be met with the serene loftiness generally assumed as a byproduct of Zen practice. While we were cloistered deep in the mountains and woods, a momentous cultural event was taking place just outside that was the first big crowd venue for a number of soon-to-be famous musicians, the Monterey Pop Festival. Guests came into Tassajara raving about performances by Jimi Hendrix, Big Brother and the Holding Company with Janis Joplin, The Who, the Mamas and the Papas, Otis Redding, the Grateful Dead, Eric Burdon and the Animals, Ravi Shankar, and the Jefferson Airplane. Marty Ballin, a lead singer for the Airplane, said that their manager, Bill Thompson, arranged for the whole band to go to Tassajara the day before the festival. He says they all dropped acid, walked around and played some impromptu music for students. Suzuki was asked to join them for dinner. He did so, and no one said a word the whole time, including Bob and me. A few students did get to enjoy some of the festival, thanks to the often playful nature of Richard Baker, who was driving the Land Rover with 7 students returning to the city. Student Lax recalls, he said, "Hey, let's go to the Monterey Festival." When we arrived, Baker said that he only had 2 tickets, but that when we went up to the gate, we should all just walk through and get lost in the crowd. Baker stood last, held up his 2 tickets, and called up to the ticket taker that he had the tickets. We all walked through as planned. Baker followed. We saw the fabulous Indian musician Ravi Shankar. Richard Baker was holding off the press to an extent, but he knew that we had to have some exposure in the media or pressure would build up. Jack Goddard was a West Coast stringer for the Village Voice. He lived in Big Sur and hiked in to do a story on what was going on at Tassajara. He came during that first half of guest season. I know that from rereading the article he wrote, but I remember him from when he returned several times later. He always walked back and forth from home by trail, and not necessarily the shortest route, which was about 9 miles. He was a loner and knew the woods well. It was somewhat dangerous for him because he had bleeding ulcers that would act up now and then. In Goddard's article, he first described people working, which reminds me of how much was going on in the creek to divert it in spots, shore up walls, put the hot water pipe to the pool back in place, get gravel for cement. He called what we did in the Zendo hard work of another kind. He called Dan Welsh Farmer Dan, commenting that he and Louise seemed to be walking right off the remotest of West Kansas farms in their rural roughness. Dan in faded overalls and she in long plain dresses. And he noted Dan still had his shoulder-length hair. The Windbell reproduced Jack's article and included a photo of Dan sitting in the Zendo in a gray robe. Most of his head hair was gone. The article concluded by stating, "The start this spring has been auspicious," and with a quote from an unnamed older student who said, "Tassajara has all the right vibrations. Zen belongs here." Jack wrote that the women were in the kitchen. Maybe he passed through when there happened not to be any men, but there were males as well, such as Ed Brown, Alan Winter, me sometimes. One place that was all women was the sewing room. We'd gotten 6 treadle sewing machines and thin gray rayon robes appropriate for the sweltering weather. They were being churned out of there lickety-split for us all to wear in the Zendo for the upcoming practice period and beyond. A prominent sign had gone up outside the entrance gate on 2 posts with 3 boards reading Tassajara, Zen Mountain Center, Zen Shinji. Now it was time for the closed signs to go up there and at Jamesburg, where the road begins. After 2 months, Tassajara closed to outsiders for the first practice period, and in a few days, Paul Disco and his crew turned the old dining room into a Zendo, working late into the night of the day before the opening. For weeks, they'd been preparing the pieces in the shop to be assembled quickly. The new Zendo had an elegant and simple altar on a raised platform that covered the old stone hearth. Where there had been tables and chairs, there were now 4 rows of zafus on zabutans on tatami and an area in back for overflow with a tall taiko drum, a gift from Eiheiji, Soto Zen's most famous and revered monastery. And what had been the Zendo up to then, the old clubhouse, as it was called, since before the turn of the century, would be a room for study and meeting, and the next guest season's dining room. A handful of people left before that practice period started. There were too many rules for some, especially the segregating of the baths for students, like the 2 couples we'd inherited from the Becks. They'd enjoyed the zazen and been most helpful, but it wasn't their trip. The thought of subjecting oneself to Tangario the initial 3 days of sitting from 5 in the morning till 9 at night with no walking meditation to stretch the legs and brief breaks only after meals discouraged some. There was a scene back then with a woman who wanted to stay and be an artist in residence, but not to have to follow the schedule. She was insistent, but so was Baker. I recall her holding out in some bushes by the railroad belt at night with a candle and a kitchen knife. I was worried she was going to hurt someone. She did, herself, gouged her hand with the knife. Baker carried her to a car, kicking and screaming, to be given a ride out after her hand was bandaged. One fragile and sensitive student later told me he left because of something I'd said. He was walking slowly in a robe on the road above the courtyard, looking so miserable, and I urged him to come on to the Zendo. There was less than a minute left to get there on time. He said, "Suzuki Roshi gave me permission not to go." I, being a true believing new student, told him he should go sit anyway. That pained him so much he left. I had no idea I'd scared him away until I interviewed him many decades later. Before the official opening day ceremony for Zen Shinji, Zen Mountain Center, and the first day of the first practice period, a Japanese priest in robes arrived on foot with a kyosaku, the stick with the round end to hold and a flat end to strike the shoulders of a sleeping sitter, which he presented to Suzuki to use in the new Zendo. I wonder if there was anything written on that stick, because his own bore the kanji for "learn for yourself" I cannot teach you anything. His name was Ejo Takada, a disciple of the great Rinzai master Mumon Yamada. Takada had founded a zendo in Mexico City in 1961 with the help of psychologist and humanist philosopher Erich Fromm. He spent much of his time with peasants in Oaxaca, cultivating soybean crops and showing them how to use soybeans to make soy milk, tofu, and other products for their protein-deficient diet, and to help them become more self-sufficient. I had the most fun job that practice period. I'd been in the kitchen before Ed came, and then helping him and setting up and running the dining room. Finally, I got to work outside, cutting firewood for the winter. Much of it was more like cutting kindling. A lot had been torn down and taken out from the main area. Thanks to Howard's destruction of the old kitchen, there was no incentive to postpone getting started on the new one, which was at that same spot. He'd just taken out the upper structure, but there was a whole elevated floor below, and some he'd left, like the old office where Peter had worked. That all went. The old big reefers, walk-in coolers were gone, as was a good deal of the deck out back. A new walk-in cooler was built at ground level near the kitchen with steps leading down to it. The second floor of the bathhouse above the plunges was taken out as it was too rickety to use. Too bad. It was good for trysts, but can't stand in the way of progress. So there was a giant mountain of 1x4s, 6s, wider, 2x, bigger than 2x. Bob Watkins put me out there with Nelda Foresta to cut it all up. We had axes, saws, and stumps. She did not want to use an axe. So she picked up the boards, held them down on a stump, and I swung the axe for hours every day. For the big stuff, we had what was called a two-man saw, even with her on the other end. Learned how to keep it all sharp. We made a big dent in that mountain by the time the practice period was over. Was that fun? I loved Zen. Something had happened that first practice period. That's where the lights are on in my memories. And I feel myself straightening up some, and others too, and the mountains, as if in higher resolution. With very few exceptions, none of us had ever done anything like that before. 2 months of concentrated zazen, kinhin, zazen, ceremonial meals, silent study, silent baths, mostly or ideally silent hard work, lectures by Suzuki, barely enough sleep, sesshin. We still had conversation, idle thoughts, heck, all our problems and neuroses. But the practice Suzuki spoke of became less of an idea and more of a reality. After sesshin, I found a student sitting on a bench out in Grasshopper Flats. She said, "There was no one creation long ago. It's happening now. It's always happening." She looked around. The world, everything, is being born right now, over and over. And she hadn't even taken LSD. So that's darkly. And I know why I called it that, because I'd say so in it. I remember the spring the late winter, spring, leading up to that first practice period. I remember getting the dining room ready. I remember the practice period starting in the second guest season, which was another, say, 6 weeks or something. But that first guest season, which was, I guess May 1st to, about 6 weeks, it's like, it's dark. I don't remember much about it. The dining room was dark. That's just what I remember. So, all right. So that's Tassajara Stories for this week. We'll see where it goes next week. I might start reading 2 of them a week. We'll see. Right now I'm trying to keep up with a bunch of other stuff, so not yet. So, until we meet again, this is DC Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, preserving the legacy of Shunryu Suzuki and those whose paths crossed his, and anything else that comes to mind. Coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Dogette Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka, wishing you and yours and all of us a grand awakening.